Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Turning Point Live. So today we've got a very special guest, Calvin Robinson, who's involved with Don't Divide Us, the Reclaim Party, and Defund the BBC. Calvin, how are you doing today?
I'm not bad, mate. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great, thank you. So just diving straight into it, first thing I want to ask you is, can you explain a little bit about Defund the BBC and what you guys do?
Sure. Defund the BBC is a grassroots movement set up initially to be a voice for the silent majority, the people who are sick and tired of the BBC peddling their woke progressive agenda day in, day out. And we've got several aims, but one of them is to decriminalize non-payment of the license fee. We want to stop clogging up the courts with people who haven't paid their license fee. And we also want to take a look at the charter and say, actually, why are we forced to pay the BBC regardless of what we're watching? You know, if we're watching live TV on ITV, Sky News, it doesn't matter what it is, we're paying a fee to the BBC for the privilege. That makes no sense in 2020. So we want to take a look at that. And we also think, it's incredibly biased. All of the content that they're putting out there, they're not catering for their audience anymore. So we need all of these areas need looking at. It's a complete and utter mess. But there's been a lot of support out there.
Oh, definitely. I think we've seen the Defund the BBC. It went from essentially a new movement to an established movement in a period of a very short period of a few months. But other than that, I guess having a look recently, I think in the past week, the BBC announced that they're getting the Vicar of Dibley to kneel to Black Lives Matter. Again, do you think that's a valid use of taxpayer money? And can you elaborate a bit more about bias in the BBC?
It's absolutely atrocious, isn't it? The Vicar of Dibley is supposed to be a comedy show, and they're going to have a serious segment in there with the Vicar of Dibley essentially preaching to the audience, to the viewers at home, to say, you know what, we need to be supporting Black Lives Matter. And at this point, that's not okay. How can anyone, after everything we know, be supporting Black Lives Matter? This is a movement that is against the family unit. It's against the police. It wants to defund the police. It's a movement that essentially wants to destroy our way of life and rebuild it in their neo-Marxist image. And that is not okay for a public service such as the BBC to be supporting. Now, I'm not saying, that we shouldn't be against racism, which is what some people think that BLM is. Of course, we should be against racism. But there are many, many legitimate campaign groups that are fighting racism. Black Lives Matter isn't one of them. We saw very recently in The Guardian of all places that 55% of the UK population think that racial tensions have increased since Black Lives Matter. So that just goes to show that they are perpetuating this myth of white privilege and black oppression and all of these horrible, horrible toxic ideologies that stem from critical race theory that essentially are making things worse in this country, not improving them. So no way should the BBC be supporting this. But this is in line with everything that the BBC's been doing, isn't it? Everything they put out there is completely woke, liberal, progressive. It is very much, gender ideology, queer ideology, anti-racist. It's all of the tick boxes of wokeness that makes them seem morally superior, but actually causes more trouble than it's worth.
So why do you think the BBC has gone down this line of wokeness? Because we go back even sort of 5 years, you had Come Fly With Me coming out, which was sort of very tongue-in-cheek. It sort of mocked everyone, but it didn't hold back in terms of sort of the banter and the jokes on there. Why do you think we've seen this recent change towards sort of this woke agenda at the BBC?
Yeah, I don't think it's been a particularly recent change. We saw the whole thing throughout over the last 4.5 years throughout Brexit. You know, the BBC took a clear stance on that. They were Remain through and through, and they clearly didn't want Brexit to happen. And they kind of had a one-sided argument. And whenever they did invite anyone from the Brexit Leave side of the argument on, they made sure the panel was heavily weighted against them with Ramonas and Remainers. So it's been going on for a while, but I think they just jump on every social justice warrior kind of bandwagon because they have such a groupthink at the BBC. So many of them are from the same background with the same mentality, and they think they're doing the right thing. They think they're good people, and they think that the rest of us are bad people for not thinking like they do. So they want to encourage us all to think like they do, which is a little bit fascist of them, if I'm honest with you.
Oh, 100%. Welcome to the broadcast, Oscar. Thank you for joining us.
Technical difficulties, but
it's Oscar from the Right Report. How are you doing, Oscar?
I'm good. Thank you very much. Yeah, on the BBC thing, I agree with you on sort of all of it about on the BBC about how, you know, they're very woke, they push their own agenda and that type of thing. But I do disagree with you on actually defunding the thing, because my attitude with it is the fact that the whole media at it. The whole media at this woke agenda stuff. They're all at it. The BBC and the rest of them. And I think if you were just to get rid, I don't think getting rid of the BBC actually solves the problem. I think it just sort of puts the problem into sort of private hands, and the same thing will be carrying on, just under sort of different management, if you like. I think it's sort of a vital British institution, which I think we should be trying to keep and trying to reform from the inside. And if we sort of get rid of it and defund it, then we have absolutely, the public have absolutely no power over it, and the government have no power over it. It's just a private institution, and it will just carry on being woke.
I did hear you were a bit wet on this issue, but that's okay. I think if we defund the BBC, then at least we're no longer paying for their wokeness, which is the key there. And that's the main issue for me, that why are we paying taxpayers' money essentially to this woke institution that have a clear political agenda? I don't understand that. Yes, it used to be a public service, it used to be a public institution. They have a lot of good content out there, but even that, so all the BBC archive footage that we've all paid for over the years with our license fee, they're trying to make us pay for it again with, what is it, BritBox or whatever? They should be putting all of that out there for us because we've already covered the fees on that. I just think it's come to a point now where the BBC is beyond repair. And I'm interested to hear you say about we need to reform from within. I've heard other people use the argument before. It didn't go down too well, did it?
What reform from within?
From within. Who else has used the argument?
Well, no, look, it's the reform from the inside is obviously sort of.
It's Ramona 101, isn't it? Come on.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, you're talking about two completely different institutions. One of them, you know, is the European Union. The other one's the BBC. But the problem we've got in my book is the fact that it's not just the BBC. It's the BBC, it's civil service. It's you know, all these government institutions. What are you going to do with all of them? You're just going to privatise all of them? No, you're not going to privatise all of them because you can't. So actually, what you should be doing is my book is actually trying to actually sort the problem out. You're not just going to go and privatise, you know, the civil service and all these institutions, because if you privatise the BBC, they're going to go on their own sort of woke agenda, and you know, and you'll still be. Sky, for example, I still pay for sort of Sky Sports and the rest of it, so the paying will still be there. And not only that, but the BBC, if you actually, aside from sort of the wokeness and the rest of it, and yeah, okay, I sound a bit wet as you describe it, but they do actually do some decent stuff. Over the years, they have done some fantastic stuff. They're an institution which is recognised globally. Some of their documentaries are sort of unparalleled with other channels, and I just think if you actually privatised it, then firstly the quality of programme might actually go down, and secondly, you're not actually solving the initial problem, which is the wokeness.
I mean, it is a fair point, but if we privatise them, it's okay for them to be woke. And I think what we need to do is step away from this idea that, or either enforce it or step away from the idea that all publications and all broadcasts in the UK need to be politically neutral, because at the moment they're not politically neutral. They're all left-leaning, they're all centre-left biased. So either we need to remove that obstacle and allow things like, you know, American or Australian Sky News, that's the best example, but American Fox News is another example that's been decent up until recently. Allow broadcasters from the right and the left, or just really enforce this requirement and say actually the BBC isn't sticking to its rules, and then implement some kind of consequence for that. But I don't see either of those things happening. So, which is why I think we need to just defund it, get on with it, get it out of the way. Yes, the civil service is an issue, but that's a completely different matter altogether.
One more thing that on this BBC thing, if you actually sort of half what I was saying before, but if you actually look at the private sector is actually the one more than anything pushing this woke agenda. You have woke capitalism, and if you just put the BBC back into the private hands, you know, it will be woke capitalism 101. It will sort of carry on with these institutions carrying on pushing this agenda. At least if it's in public hands, and you can elect a government. You know, this government isn't the one for me. I think they're not doing great, but you can elect a government to actually change the position. Because if you look at Sky and you look at the rest of the television programs, they're the ones pushing Black Lives Matter, and they're still the ones pushing all these woke agendas.
Sure, but you're living in dreamland there, Oscar. I mean, what government are you going to elect that's going to be any further right wing than the one we've got? This was pretty much the ideal government. They haven't come through in a lot of ways, but this was the ideal government for a lot of people. I can't see us electing a government that is going to handle the BBC more strongly than this one. You know, we're not going to get anyone fighting our corner that isn't there already. So if they're not doing it now, when are they going to do it? That's my question, which is why we have to take it into our own hands and say, actually, forget it, let's defund them.
Yeah, because I think we even saw when the Conservatives, they tried to appoint, I forget his name, but he was meant to be a right-wing sort of director of the BBC, and he bottled it because he didn't want to go into essentially into a sort of nest of vipers in the BBC. And so the issue we have is if we're going to keep paying for it, we either sack a lot of them who are all leftists, Marxists, or worse, and we put in people who are actually neutral, are going to produce TV and have sort of a fair and balanced view. Or the alternative is, if we're not going to do that because the government haven't got the stones to do that, I guess privatize it, because at least then we're not paying for it, and we can set up something like GB News, get behind GB News, maybe other outlets, maybe have like Sky Australia broadcasting over here, and actually maybe Sky UK can start being a bit more like Sky Australia.
Mate, Rita Panahi, that's all I'm asking for, man.
I think Calvin actually made sort of a decent point amongst his
thanks.
Lot of waffle, a lot of neoliberal waffle, but amongst all that, he actually did make a good point.
Did he just call me a neolib? Carry on.
Amongst all that, he did actually make a good point, and that was actually changing the way it's structured and not letting it be so neutral. So I thought about this, and I thought, if you actually look at the radio, and you look at sort of radio stations, you look at things like LBC, and you look at talk radio and LBC, for example. You know, you have Majid Nawaz, who's sort of a liberal centrist one hour, and the next hour you have James O'Brien, who's, you know, a little bit nuts. And then, you know, the next hour, where you used to have Nigel Farage and that type of thing. Talk radio does a similar thing. Actually, if you start doing this, where you think, okay, well, you might have an hour for so and so to actually sort of present his own position, and then you might have someone on the contradictory one. Doesn't actually need to be politically neutral. It just needs to show different political positions. Now, that's what I think.
And I love this. This sounds great, but who's going to do it is the question. With Defund the BBC, this is a campaign that's in our hands. It's a grassroots movement. There is no movement. There is no government. Quango. There is no Dominic Cummings in number 10. No one's implementing this. So it's not a viable alternative.
But it's absolutely not in your hands. If you privatize the BBC, okay, you just ending up with another monopoly in the market. That it's not in the public's hands at all. You just have monopolies, and you won't actually have a hell of a lot of choice. At least if it's in the public hands, you have the democratically elected government, which you can choose. Now, you did make the point about this government being right wing. I beg to differ. I think this government is just incredibly centrist, very liberal, and I think it's a populist.
I wish this government was liberal, mate. We wouldn't be under all the restrictions we're under right now. It's bonkers to suggest they're liberal.
It's incredibly socially liberal. This government is, you know, Boris Johnson is a centrist. He's a Blairite, effectively, in my book. This government is incredibly centrist. This is not a socially conservative right-wing government at all, and I think it's bonkers to suggest so.
I'm not saying it's socially conservative. I'm saying it's a right-wing government, as in these are the most right-wing politicians we have in the center, in the political sphere. People like Priti Patel, who we've all said would be great in the Home Office, get there, and all we hear is rhetoric. So I'm not backing them. I'm not saying they're amazing, but I'm saying this is as good as it's going to get. Since Thatcher, we haven't seen a government like this, and we're not going to see one even more right-wing than this. I can't imagine it. So unless you have a different perspective.
But they're not. They're even Thatcher was a neoliberal. I mean, just selling off all of our industry, all of our stuff for sort of parts and the rest of it. It's just neoliberal 101. There's nothing conservative about this government. at all. And I do get that point about, you said it, if we did have a Conservative government, then maybe the BBC could reform. But I just don't think, to be honest, that that smashing through our institutions and privatising the whole thing and letting them do what Sky do, which is run round a football pitch with a kneeling.
Defund the BBC isn't about privatising the BBC anyway. But regardless of that, this isn't about giving power to the neo-libs, and it's not everything. Not everything comes down to neo-lib versus social conservatism. I think that's a very binary view. I think it's a very mature view. You know, there's nuance in this. Yes, the Conservative Party is more liberal than it's ever been in a long time, but it is still the home of social conservatives that want to make a difference in the public sphere. We have fringe parties on the outside that can apply pressure onto the Conservative government, but there won't be a government that is more conservative, which is my point, than the Conservative government. So we have to really lobby them to make changes that we want to see. I think it's really bizarre to suggest that we're going to somehow get a more socially conservative government. I don't know which party you're thinking is going to get into power there.
I'm not particularly suggesting party. No, you're right. No other party will get into power, but suggest that this specific government is right wing is, in my book, is absolute nonsense. I mean, Boris Johnson is a centrist neoliberal. I mean, he just is. He's always been that. He's incredibly socially liberal, and if anything, he's a populist. Actually, in my book, I think he just sort of says things in order to please a crowd, in order to get elected, and I think that's what he's done for the last sort of 5 years.
Yeah. I mean, you're playing semantics. Of course, he's centre right technically, if we're talking economically, but socially, he's much more liberal than I am personally. But that doesn't make him, not centre right. I wouldn't go as far as to call him a centrist. I think that's just being a bit pedantic, to be honest with you.
Well,
moving on, just because I'm conscious of time, let's shift our focus onto the Black Lives Matter movement. So, Calvin, you recently spoke out again against Black Lives Matter, and in particular sort of the campaign around trying to keep essentially criminals, foreign nationals who served sentences in the UK. You've got, I think, 70 Labour MPs signed a letter and invoked sort of the Windrush generation to try and keep them in the UK. What's your opinion and take on that situation?
I think it's absolutely disgusting, isn't it? It's, again, more of this metropolitan liberal elite shoveling their woke culture down our throats with their social justice warrior nonsense. It is, and I know I shoved a load of buzzwords into a sentence there, but it is essentially these celebs saying, actually, we are morally superior to the rest of you plebs. We know what's best, and it's very mean to send people home because they've been bad, so let's keep them here. It's like, well, excuse me? And then they're using the term Windrush to kind of it's a whistleblower, isn't it? It's essentially saying, well, the Tories are racist, that's why they want to send people home. And that's nonsense, because Windrush was effectively a generation of people that came over to the UK when the UK was in dire need of labour, of support. So my grandparents on my paternal side came over during Windrush from Jamaica, from the Commonwealth. They were very excited. They were already Commonwealth citizens, but they were very happy to become British citizens. It was a great time for them and for people in this country and from where they came from. But to link the two things together, I find it very abhorrent and quite disgusting, because the people that we were trying to send home recently were, yes, they were from the Commonwealth or from Jamaica, but they were not British citizens, and they were criminals, convicted criminals. We're talking about murderers, rapists, horrible people that don't deserve to be here. It's absolutely quite right to send them home. It doesn't matter where they came from. And I think for the celebs to be lecturing us and telling us it's mean, it's not right, and linking it to Windrush is horrible.
Well, yeah, and it tarnishes the Windrush's reputation, because the Windrush generation, as you mentioned, they were hard workers. They weren't rapists. They weren't murderers. They weren't people who broke the law. They're people who came here and helped us in a dire time for us. After the Second World War, when the economy was starting to collapse, obviously we just lost a lot of good men in the war, lots of heroes. And so we needed the Windrush to come along. It's almost, why are the left trying to link these great people who came over to help us with criminals, rapists, and even killers? It's ridiculous.
No, spot on. I'd love to hear what Oscar thinks about this one.
This one, no, on this, I completely agree. I think that if you commit criminal crime and the rest of it, then deporting people for that type of thing is spot on. I don't see a problem with it. I would like to hear your opinion actually on, well, I know your opinion already, but on the Millwall situation, on the Millwall fans and the rest of it, and how, and also, and not only that, but I don't know if you saw afterwards, there was a case in the Champions League with PSG, and someone called, the fourth official called someone, or said to the referee to book the quote unquote black man over there. So I'd be interested to see sort of your, firstly the Millwall thing, and then maybe that.
So with Millwall, I thought it was absolutely fantastic to hear the fans booing. That was great. I've argued with John Barnes about this because obviously he comes from the perspective that, oh no, the Millwall fans are obviously racist because they're booing Black Lives Matter. But then we saw later when Millwall came on with an equality banner, all of the fans applauded, they clapped. So it isn't that the fans at Millwall are against justice or equality or anything like that, or anti-racism in general. It is just that they're against Black Lives Matter, like the rest of us. And again, it's another public body, another large corporate institution that is backing what is essentially a neo-Marxist campaign. And we've all learned what BLM stand for by this point. So there is no excuse for anyone to be supporting them unless you are anti-Semitic, anti-British, and want to destroy our way of life. And I think as the crowds start to return to the stadiums and the footballers continue to do their blooming kneeling, they're going to learn the lesson the hard way that we don't want to see it. None of us want to see it. Regarding the PSG thing, I didn't see that. Didn't see what happened there.
No, that's fair enough. No, because I got half caught up on it. Basically, what happened was you had the referee came and one of the coaches on the team was going to be sent off or something, and he came to the fourth official and said, "Who was it that I need to send off?" And he said, "Oh, the black man over there." And John Barnes actually, it was the one that said, "Well, that's not racist. He's just saying he's just identifying someone by sort of colour of their skin, which is just
right." Well, that's a good point, is it? Hi, Richard Taylor, by the way. That's a good point, because we can no longer use these terms to describe people, like these obvious things. It's so funny when you're talking to someone, especially like a upper middle class white person who's obviously woke and trying not to offend you, and they're trying to describe someone, and they'll say everything except the most obvious thing about them. I'll be like, "Have you seen such and such? Or what do they look like? Or where are they?" They're like, "Oh yeah, he's about 6'2".
The coloured guy.
But they will do anything to say the black person or the person of color or the colored person or whatever. And I don't think that's necessarily offensive. I think we have to take into consideration intent and the context that these things are said in. I'm sure there are ways you can use the word black guy in a racist and derogatory way, but if you're describing who someone is or what they look like, I don't think it is. It's the same with colored person or person of color. I've never understood the difference between the two. It baffles me that one of them is really offensive and can get a CEO fired, and the other one is perfectly okay.
I'd use the example as well. How often do you think I get called a ginger, insert expletive? You know, it's like you can take it as you
Jack,
get
do you have a soul?
Right, I'm going to be protesting your office tomorrow. No. But yeah, you can get offended over things, and again, it just applies to context, because a lot of the time people don't mean anything by it, and obviously you can get angry in certain situations, as you said, with the right context, if people are getting aggressive with you. But if someone's and it's an honest mistake, whether they're intending to be offensive or not, it's part of society just moving on and being civilized about stuff like that and being sensible. But actually, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, this is a big thing of mine, Jack. It really is, in that we are so privileged to live in this great country that one of the worst things that happens to us is that we get offended. But we forget that is a privilege, and people go on about privilege all the time these days, but that is one that we have, in that we can be offended, and that's probably the worst thing that will happen to us in our day. But that is a choice. We choose to be offended, especially when it's down to words, right? A lot of people in countries around the world don't get that privilege because they've got serious hardships and real things going on in their lives that they can't afford to take offense at words that people have said. So we need to remember that. But also, when people do say or do things wrong to us, we need to remember the Christian value, the British value of forgiveness, especially when there's an apology. Yes, sometimes there are consequences to words and actions, but after those consequences, there should be an apology and there should be forgiveness from the other person or party. And that is where we're losing ourselves at the moment. And that's where cancel culture is taking over, because we're just no platforming people and saying that person is no longer, allowed to essentially be a person or have an opinion because they did or said something wrong at some point in their past. That's very scary and very worrying. We need to move away from that. It's not very British.
No, exactly. I think you hit the nail on the head there with the forgiveness thing. I think for the last 10 years, sort of, people have wanted to find something to be offended in, but actually, when you point it out and someone goes, "Oh, okay, no, I made a mistake," and they sort of apologize for it, which is a normal thing to do because no one's perfect and everyone makes mistakes, whether it is in sort of everyday life or in politics or something. But that's not accepted. An apology will never be accepted because everyone is deemed to be perfect and has to be perfect. And we've seen it, I think, most recently, probably the funniest one was with Beth Rigby and Kay. Yeah, and where they spent 10 months, was it? Well, it was about 6 months, sort of bashing Dominic Cummings for breaking lockdown rules. Then suddenly they go and do exactly the same. Now, they were calling for Dominic Cummings to be fired, but they're not handing in their resignations. They're just taking a 6-month suspension or a 3-month suspension. If they're following their own rules, they should be the first to resign, but they're not.
It's the hypocrisy of the left, isn't it? Thank you for the kind words, Pauline Gaynor. But it's really, wokeness eats itself, because you can never reach their standards, because the goalpost is always moving. There's always going to be someone coming for you because you've done or said something that is now no longer appropriate anymore. And this is why we need to cancel, if we cancel anything, cancel woke culture, because it's just unsustainable,
Definitely. And I think actually moving on to another point, just again, because I'm conscious of time, something we were discussing on Turning Point yesterday. So we put out a graphic saying we don't think that people in schools should be taught this whole gender science rubbish. So being told they can be where they can choose their gender every day, that there's more than 2 genders, all of that sort of rubbish. And we're very against that. And we were told actually you're looking at limiting free speech there of people, and it was trying to make the argument to people that actually it's not limiting free speech as such, it's stopping the indoctrination of children, because if they're not allowed to question that and they're being taught it as fact, that's a problem. But what's your whole opinion on this sort of attempted indoctrination of children with this gender pseudoscience in schools?
Yeah, on one side of the argument, I think people can identify as whatever the hell they like. Today, I'm identifying as a ginger person, Jack. I'm one of you. But on the other hand, we should not expect people to play along with that, right? So a guy is a guy, a woman is a woman. A mixed race guy is a mixed race guy, a white guy is a white guy, right? We can't just pretend to be something we're genetically not. But at the same time, those things don't matter. That's the problem. We've gotten to the point where identity politics has taken over so much that your sex, your gender, whatever, your race, your religion, all of these things have too much of an importance. Your sexuality is another one. They have too much importance. It's not. They all make up a part of your identity, but they're not the core of your identity. And this is the thing I keep coming back to, that essentially what brings us all together is that we're all British. So let's stop the hard left dividing that down into all these different subcategories that are, these people against that, those people, etc., etc. And where that starts is in school. And this is, where I've been campaigning for the last bloody too long to mention, in that the indoctrination going on in schools is ridiculous. And I wrote a piece in the Catholic Herald in their latest issue about this exact issue, actually, because what the government has done, and again, this is the government being too liberal and not socially conservative at all, is that they've put a new curriculum in place, something that you wouldn't expect from the Tories, from the Conservatives, that is very susceptible to gender theory and to queer theory. And we've seen infiltration from mermaids, from Stonewall. They're putting out resources for schools to use. They're going into schools and delivering talks on gender and sexuality, which wouldn't always be a problem. But what the government have done here is they've now made it illegal for parents to remove their children from these classes, from relationship, health, and sex education, which we've always had. We've always had sex ed. Sex education was always in secondary school, and now it's shifted down with this new curriculum into primary, which is a major concern of mine to begin with. We shouldn't have any sex education in primary school. But to remove parents' rights and responsibilities, that is a step too far. Education should be supplemental to what happens at home. It's a parent's right and responsibility to educate their child. Schools help with that. The state should never assume or presume to take over from the parent in that way. That is very concerning and something we all need to campaign against, whether we believe in gender theory and queer theory or not. It doesn't matter. The government has no right to take parents' responsibilities and rights away from them in that way.
I think as well, it's one of the issues that we've seen is sort of the extreme level of even going into sex education. So I remember when my brother was 13, so he's 20 now, so this is going back 7 years, he came home from school and said they were taught about anal fisting in their sexual education, which is extreme. Like, that should never be taught to a child at all. Again, I had a family friend whose daughter said to her, they were saying that she came out from school and she was 12 years old and they've been taught how to put condoms onto plastic penises, which is completely wrong. Again, it's completely inappropriate sexual education, and it just questions who's actually approving this stuff, who's checking this stuff, and allowing this stuff in schools.
Absolutely. And I've hammered the government on this, but at the same time, credit where it's due. They did stand up, and when they realized that it all gone wrong, as we said it was going to, they came out and said, look, it's not okay to have politically aligned organizations, whether it's providing resources or coming in to deliver talks. So Stonewall and Mermaids are two examples I keep using because they're so extreme, but you're not allowed to use their resources. You're not allowed to have them into your schools if they are delivering these theories as fact, much like the government came out and talked about critical race theory not being allowed to be taught as fact in schools. It's the same for these theories, but the problem is that they opened the door in the first place. They pushed this new curriculum when it wasn't necessary, wasn't needed, and I don't know who's lobbying for it, and I don't know where it came from, but we all need to be concerned about that, and we all need to be standing up against it.
Yeah, I'd say that I agree with Perry. Also, I think that to add to that, I think that it's a show that all these sorts of things are going, and I think the relationship between the state and the family or even the child is changing actually, whereas before, as sort of Calvin touched upon, the raising of children really is down to the parents. The parents decide how they want to raise their children. And I mean, that's only sane, but I think what we have seen is one of the reasons for it is just a huge rise in divorces and broken families, which slightly tweaks the relationship between the child and the state, where the state sort of does come in. And then when the state comes in, it starts to sort of implement its own values and the rest of it, which can be dangerous. And I think we've seen it even more now, where you're right, when you're actually teaching sort of gender theories and that type of thing, which they're not just teaching it, they're teaching it as fact and science, which is even more scary. When I was in school, when I was year 7, 8, I was taught that there was only 2 genders and that they were determined pretty much by your biological sex and your chromosomes. Now, that I don't know, but I'm assuming that must have gone out the window by now. That, or they're sort of teaching 2 things that are contradictory. I don't understand it at all. But it seems like everything that we've been taught for the last 100 years has just been absolutely forgotten, and we're now starting from year 0 and starting on this new woke course, which makes absolutely no sense to anyone and changes every year.
Completely agree. It's a difficult topic, especially one you just mentioned around gender and sex. It's one that's I find difficult to talk about because the trolls out there are something else. I've campaigned on a lot of issues and received a lot of abuse, especially over race. But the people that come out when you mention anything to do with gender or sex are just vicious, atrocious people. You know who I'm talking about, the ones with creepy anime avatars on Twitter and rainbows and pronouns in their bios, but once they start, oh god, I avoid them like the plague. So it's working. What they're doing is working. It's shutting people up.
Definitely. And even in real life as well, there was an incident in Portsmouth where a feminist group had a meeting about domestic violence, but I think they got labelled as TERFs or something, and they had the trans lobby come around, bang on the windows while they were inside with elected councillors harassing them, saying, oh, you're transphobic. But when they're trying to have a debate about domestic violence, it's the same at Sussex University, the university Oscar's at, where they had one lecturer who I guess they described as a TERF, and they're doing everything they can to get her kicked out of the university. But despite the fact she's not said anything illegal, offensive, anything that could be classified as hate speech, she's just sort of speaking her opinion, which again is a mainstream, widely held opinion in the UK, and they're trying to cancel her. So it's a very vicious lobby against anyone. You can look at J.K. Rowling, another classic example.
It's all very much us versus them, isn't it, now, with the hard left? They paint themselves as the good guys, and therefore, by default, anyone who's not with them is against them. And that is a very problematic place to be in. The world isn't that binary. And like you say, big people like J.K. Rowling are starting to fight back, which means they can't, and because they're so big, they can't be cancelled. That is very helpful. People like that need to stand up, and then the rest of us can kind of follow suit.
I'm just conscious of time as well, guys. Oscar, do you want to ask Calvin the last question of the discussion?
Well, you know the last question.
Awesome, no worries. So, Calvin, I guess
I thought you had planned something.
No,
go ahead.
Yes, I was going to say the last thing I was going to ask you. So, I've seen a few people commenting. Let me see if I can find it again.
Just want to address a point that is constantly popping up in the comments right at the moment, that we're lazy to blame the left. I'm talking about the hard left. You know who I'm talking about, the neo-Marxists, the people who are pushing this SJW woke culture. I don't know what else you want me to refer to them as. It's not cowardice, it's just a handy label. What are you talking about?
Oh, 100%. I think that's we need to start identifying who these people are. There's people who are trying to bring around the societal collapse of Britain to bring in Marxism. And we see that whether, again, when you get Stalinists like McDonnell essentially supporting all of this trans nonsense, there's only one reason he's doing it, which is to try and degrade Britain, and destroy traditional gender roles, which make Britain strong. So it's very frustrating, actually, that people say, oh, you can't just blame the left, when, yeah, it is them behind it. Whether they actually agree with it or not, they see it as the quickest way to bring around their twisted ideology.
I sort of half agree with you too. I think that I think Calvin was spot on when he specifically called them sort of the Marxist hard left. But also, I think that if the right keeps sort of left bashing and sort of bashing the left, actually what you're doing is you're alienating a hell of a lot of normal people on the left. We had Paul Embry on last week, and Paul Embry's just talking facts, straight common sense facts, and he's a man of the left. Now, my worry is that when you keep sort of bashing the left, you're actually alienating not so much Paul Embry, but other people like him and that have sort of similar beliefs. I think that the right needs to maybe be a little bit more specific and zone in on the issue, which is neo-Marxist leftism, or the Long March to our institutions. Zone into specific things, because most of the left are sort of half normal people, to be honest with you.
I'd say I agree with you to a degree. Like, I think people like Paul are great, but the issue you've got with the left is they don't call it out. So you've got sort of the 1 in a million like Paul, but most of them, they sat there with all this going on in the Labour Party. They're not openly criticising it. It's a small minority speaking against the wokeism. They all sat there with Jeremy Corbyn when he was outed as sort of an anti-Semite and a complete nutter, and they didn't say anything. So if you're voting for Labour or left-wing groups, look at their policies. And yeah, you might agree with, oh, I like their tax stuff, but when you vote for them, you vote for everything. So you either set up a new party, like something that sort of Calvin's done with Reclaim with Lawrence Fox, so you can actually stand by your principles, or you're collaborating with what they're doing. So as much as I'd like to say, yeah, we know not all lefties are complete nutters, but they're voting for them. That's the issue.
You kind of find out how cheap those principles are, don't you, at the end of the day, when they're giving out free stuff.
Yeah, true. But I mean, that's sort of half thing. What sort of the Remain side did to the Leave side. Said Leave side and Leave voters, they sort of categorised all of them by the way they're voting, and then you judge all of them. And I think we sort of have to stray away from that. I think that we need to zone in on specific issues and people and the leaders and call them out. But also, I think when you actually categorise all of the left and all of the people in it as one group of people, what you do is you tribalise the whole thing. And then they sort of think, oh, well, I'm being attacked, I have to defend the left. And it's like, no, right, okay, most of the people on the left and most sort of Labour voters, or past Labour voters, are just normal people who have to have disagreements. It's sort of the hard liberal and Marxist elements of the left that need to be called out. And actually, I think we need to bring sort of the normal left along with us, actually, in the fight against this absolute nutty wokeism.
I think you're both right, because on the right, or on the centre right, wherever you guys see yourselves, we call out the far right when they're stepping over the mark. On the left, they don't call out the hard left, and that's what they need to start doing. They need to take care of their own house, get their own house in order, because if we keep calling it out, it does become entrenched. It becomes binary. So they need to do it from their end as well.
100%. And on that note, I think that was actually a good topic to finish on. So thank you very much, Calvin, for coming on the show again. We'd love to have you on at some point again in future.
An absolute pleasure. And Oscar wasn't as wet as people told me he was going to be.
You weren't as neoliberal as I thought you would.
All right. Thank you to both of you for coming on. And thank you, everyone watching. We should be back next week. So stay tuned. Have a look at our story on Instagram and Facebook, and that will let you know when the next broadcast is going to be. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming on, and thank you, everyone, for watching.